Elias lived in a world where the sun never truly rose. Even in the brightest daylight, a thick, invisible fog of what if shadowed his every step. Every phone call was a potential tragedy. Every silence was a brewing storm. This wasn't just stress, it was a state of constant, exhausting hypervigilance. He was a man held hostage by a future that hadn't happened yet, forever braced for an impact that never seemed to come. Internally, Elias was a prisoner of a mind that refused him parole. He navigated his days with a forced smile, his eyes always looking for the exit, searching for the threat just around the corner. His body was a battlefield where his mind fought ghosts. His chest felt squeezed by iron bands, making every breath a shallow struggle. It was as if his lungs had forgotten how to expand fully, leaving him in a state of perpetual oxygen debt. At night, the darkness offered no sanctuary. Insomnia was his only companion, turning his bedroom into a courtroom where he was both defendant and judge. He would lie awake for hours, replaying every mistake until birds began to chirp at dawn. His heart would race for no reason, a frantic drumbeat signaling an emergency that existed only within his skull. The adrenaline meant for survival was now a poison, circulating through his veins at all times. Lately, the walls had been closing in. A series of professional failures had stripped away his remaining sense of security. A major project he spearheaded collapsed under the weight of his own indecision, leading to office whispers and a formal warning. Then came the health scare, a sudden sharp pain that sent him to emergency room. After hours of tests, the doctors found nothing physically wrong. "It's just anxiety," they told him. But to Elias, just anxiety felt like a slow-motion execution. He was drowning in a shallow pool, unable to find the floor, paralyzed by the realization that his mind was sabotaging his body. It all came to a head on a Tuesday evening during a violent rainstorm. Elias sat in his car, the wipers fighting a losing battle. He needed to drive home, but his shaking hands were so violent he couldn't grip steering wheel. The smell of stale coffee and damp upholstery filled the space as he gasped for air. The car was stationary, but his mind was racing at 100 miles an hour, projecting images of catastrophes on rain-streaked windshield. He felt paralyzed, a literal and metaphorical stall in the middle of a life he no longer recognized. The rain pounded on the roof like thousands of tiny hammers. In the glove box, tucked beneath old receipts, lay a weathered, leather-bound journal. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who survived war and famine, yet died with an unshakable peace. Elias pulled it out, his fingers tracing the cracked spine. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. He opened the yellowed pages and found a note tucked inside in his grandfather's elegant hand. It spoke of a secret place, a sanctuary where fear is not just managed but traded for strength. There were coordinates and a name, the Chapel of the Silent Word. Driven by a desperation that outweighed his terror, Elias followed the directions to the edge of town. There, nestled among ancient oaks, stood a forgotten stone chapel. He stepped out of his car, the cold rain soaking his shirt in seconds. Every instinct told him to run, but a magnetic pull drew him forward. He pushed open heavy oak doors, their hinges groaning in protest. The smell of old incense and dust filled his nostrils as he crossed threshold. As Elias stepped into the gloom, the air grew unnaturally still. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind swept past him, and the massive doors slammed shut behind him with a thunderous boom. The silence that followed was heavy, ancient, and far more terrifying than the storm outside. The booming echo of the doors died away, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure against Elias's eardrums. He stood frozen, his back pressed against the cold, rough wood of the entrance, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. The only light came from a few flickering votive candles near the altar, their orange glow casting long, dancing shadows across the stone floor. It was then that he realized the silence wasn't empty. A rhythmic, soft sound reached him, the gentle scrape of a match against a striking surface. In the corner of his eye, a small flame bloomed. Standing by a tall iron candelabra was an elderly man, his back bowed slightly by time, but his hands remarkably steady. This was the caretaker, a figure who seemed less like a stranger and more like a part of the chapel's very architecture, as much a fixture as the pews or the stained glass. Elias opened his mouth to speak, to apologize for the intrusion, or perhaps to ask for directions out of his own madness, but the words died in his throat. The caretaker didn't turn around. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was soft, yet carried the resonance of ancient stone. He didn't ask Elias who he was or why he had come. Instead, he began to describe the heavy, cold chains that Elias wore beneath his expensive clothes. He spoke of the what-ifs that kept him awake until the birds began to mock him at dawn. He named the specific burning shame of the failed professional project and the phantom pains that had driven Elias to the emergency room just weeks prior. It was as if the man was reading from the ledger of Elias's most private agonies, mirror-imaging the very thoughts Elias thought were buried deep within his soul. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. How could this man see the Goliaths that followed him? The caretaker spoke of the debt that felt like a tightening noose around Elias's neck, and the gnawing loneliness that hummed in the background of every forced social interaction. He was mapping the geography of Elias's fear with terrifying precision. "I have to be careful," Elias stammered, his voice cracking as he finally found his breath. "The world isn't safe. You don't understand the pressure. If I don't anticipate every potential disaster, if I don't stay vigilant, I'll lose everything I've worked for." He was defending his own prison, clinging to the bars because he had forgotten what it was like to stand in the open air. He argued that his fear was a logical response to a chaotic life, a necessary armor for a man who had already seen his foundations crack. He told the old man that worry was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely, believing his hypervigilance was his only weapon against a cruel world. The caretaker finally turned, his eyes reflecting the candlelight with a clarity that was unnerving. He looked at Elias not with pity, but with a deep, knowing recognition. He gestured to the shadows stretching across the vaulted ceiling, which seemed to pulse in time with Elias's racing heart. As he did, the darkness in the corners of the chapel seemed to thicken, forming hulking, distorted shapes that loomed over the pews. These were the psychological manifestations of his anxieties, the debt, the illness, the crushing weight of being enough. "You think your worry is a shield," the caretaker said, his voice echoing in the rafters, "but it is actually a prayer to the wrong God. You are using your imagination to build a temple for your fears instead of a bridge to your peace." He explained that anxiety is simply faith directed at the enemy, a constant, exhausting meditation on the power of tragedy rather than the power of grace. He pointed out that Elias was sacrificing his present on the altar of a future that might never exist. The man stepped closer, his presence radiating a calm that Elias found both magnetic and terrifying. He told Elias that the heavy armor of worry he wore was actually the very thing preventing his spirit from breathing. To find the secret place mentioned in his grandfather's journal, Elias would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to drop his guard. He would have to stand vulnerable before the silence and stop trying to control the uncontrollable. "I know the weight of those chains," the caretaker whispered, his voice trembling with a memory of old pain. "I once sat exactly where you are sitting, convinced that the shadows would eventually consume me. I spent decades building walls that only became my tomb." He reached out a hand, pointing toward the altar, where a single large candle burned with a pure white flame. He revealed that he had found a way out, a path through the storm that didn't involve fighting it. He spoke of a prayer that was different from any Elias had heard, not a plea for mercy or a list of complaints, but a command of authority. He promised that this prayer didn't just ask for help, it commanded the spirit of fear to depart entirely. He looked Elias in the eye, promising that the man who walked out of those doors would not be the man who had entered. The caretaker stepped into the center of the nave, his shadow merging with the shifting dark of the rafters. He did not ask Elias to kneel. Instead, he commanded him to stand tall, as if the very act of uprightness was the first blow against the spirit of fear. The old man began to speak, his voice carrying a rhythmic ancient power that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He led the way into a prayer that was not a polite request, but a legal demand for the return of a stolen peace. As Elias tried to repeat the first words, "I surrender the weights I was never meant to carry," He felt a searing physical resistance in his throat. It was as if the invisible chains, those cold iron links forged from years of hypervigilance, were tightening one last time to stifle the sound of their own breaking. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper at first, a fragile thing struggling against the crushing weight of his history. The prayer intensified, the caretaker's voice rising like a drumbeat against the silence of the chapel. Elias pushed through the constriction in his chest, forcing the words out until his whisper grew into a resonant declaration. He felt a sudden, sharp sensation in the center of his heart, a sensation of spiritual surgery being performed without a blade. It was the feeling of those heavy, phantom chains finally snapping under the pressure of the truth. He could almost hear the rhythmic metallic clatter of those invisible shackles hitting the consecrated stone floor. The Goliaths that had loomed over his life, the crushing debt, the phantom illnesses, and the suffocating loneliness seemed to shrink, losing their terrifying stature as the authority of the prayer took hold. The secret place mentioned in his grandfather's weathered journal was finally revealing itself not as a physical location, but as a frequency of the soul where fear simply could not breathe. The darkness that had pulsed in the corners of the chapel began to recede, but it wasn't chased away by the flickering votive candles. Instead, a warm golden light began to emanate from within Elias himself, a honey-hued radiance that seemed to leak from the very marrow of his bones. This incandescent peace settled over his shoulders like a weighted blanket of pure grace, grounding his frantic spirit. The prayer shifted, focusing now on the reclamation of his identity. He spoke of the sound mind, promised to those who seek it, casting out the spirit of timidity that had held him hostage for so long. The phrase, sound mind, echoed through the high-arched ceiling, acting as a divine tuning fork that aligned his scattered, panicked thoughts into a single, focused harmony of courage. Outside, the frantic, rhythmic drumming of the storm against the roof ceased with an abruptness that was startling. The howling wind died down to a gentle, distant sigh, leaving the world in a state of expectant stillness. Within the chapel, Elias took a breath, a full, deep, expansive breath that reached the very bottom of his lungs for the first time in years. It was as if he had been drowning in shallow air his entire adult life and had finally broken the surface of a dark ocean. He felt a lightness that defied the laws of gravity, a buoyancy of the spirit that made the heavy stone walls around him feel like gossamer. His hands, which had been shaking violently in the car just an hour ago, were now perfectly still, resting at his sides with a quiet, newfound strength. When Elias turned to thank the man who had guided him through the fire, the caretaker was gone. The elderly guardian had receded into the shadows, or perhaps into the very history of the chapel itself, leaving Elias alone with the flickering candles and the profound silence. He realized then that the caretaker had been a mirror, showing him that the power to break the fever of anxiety had been his inheritance all along. The secret place was now a portable sanctuary he would carry within him into every boardroom, every doctor's office, and every lonely night. He walked toward the heavy oak doors, which now swung open with a soft, welcoming creak. Stepping out into the night, he found the world utterly transformed. The rain had washed the air clean, and the moon, peeking through the breaking clouds, cast a silver glow over the wet pavement. The colors of the night, the deep emerald of the oaks, the charcoal gray of the road, seemed sharper, more vivid, as if a thick film had been peeled away from his eyes. The challenges of his life remained, but they were no longer monsters. They were merely mountains to be climbed. Elias walked back to his car with a steady pace, his heart no longer a drum of dread, but a compass of courage. He was finally ready to live.